So last year, Australia's High Court ruled that indefinite detention of illegal immigrants who can't be deported for various reasons, like they're violent and dangerous and can't go back to their home countries, was unlawful. This resulted in the release of about 150 dangerous detainees into the Australian community, a number of which committed violent crimes in the interim, including the recent physical assault of a Perth grandmother by one of these detainees. But this morning, the High Court ruled in response to a challenge from one asylum seeker that indefinite detention is lawful under certain conditions. This is a huge decision, much to discuss, and joining me to dissect it is LNP federal member for Hinkler, Keith Pitt. Keith Pitt, fabulous to have you here this evening. How have you been since we last spoke?
Daisy, it's great to be with you. And in fact, I got to Ayers Rock this week as part of a public works committee, which I'd never seen. And I've got to say, it's fabulous. Every Australian should see it.
That's so cool. You know, I've been to the Outback one time in my life. And when you get out there, like in the red dirt, you know exactly what I mean. Photos can't do it justice. You have to be there. So since then, I've always been like, oh my God, I've got to go to Ayers Rock. So thank you. That is very much on my bucket list. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Now, Keith, huge news this morning. The High Court handed down what is, I guess, technically a win for the Albanese government. Hundreds of detainees will remain behind bars because the court blocked AEST 17's bid for freedom. That's the asylum seeker. So, Keith, tell me, what was your reaction to this ruling?
Well, Daisy, firstly, I want to be really clear. This is not a win for the Albanese government. It's a win for the Australian people and the Australian people's safety and security. And it is the right decision. And we've seen the incompetence of the Albanese government, particularly Minister Giles, that has allowed a very large number of former detainees to be released into the community. And we now have allegations, as you outlined at the commencement of the program, of the assault of a Perth grandmother. We have other cases that we're aware of, which have been reported in the media, alleged cases, of course, Daisy. But this is a direct result of the Albanese government's inability to manage the national security and the security of all Australians and the communities that they live in.
Yes, to be clear, they are alleged cases, and they are certainly concerning allegations. And the release of those 150 or so detainees last year, it was a massive blow to the Albanese government. It highlighted their incompetence, and I think the fact that no matter how they try to frame it, Labor is not good on immigration. They're not good. They've got a track record to prove that. But do you think this decision from the High Court can undo any of that damage?
It's been a complete debacle. They clearly didn't know what they were doing. They've rushed legislation into the Parliament and demanded we pass it, and we certainly assisted in some earlier. And the most recent iteration, we've got a number of concerns with. In fact, there are 118 submissions to the inquiry that looked at that proposed legislation. 117 of them were opposed, would you believe?
Oh, wow.
And in terms of the politics, well, I think we should forget politics for the moment, Daisy. This is about the security of people in their own communities. I mean, would you want some of these individuals who are literally murderers and rapists and have been found guilty of sexual assault, terrorism offences, all sorts of things? Well, actually, it might not be terrorism. I'll take that back. In your community, living next door to you or your children or your relatives? And I think the answer to that would be a very clear no, and they shouldn't be in the community. But once again, Minister Giles's failures are just spectacular. Absolutely spectacular in how bad they are.
I mean, they really are. Like, we've had at least like 2 or 3 boats show up on our borders, for goodness sake, coming from places like Indonesia carrying illegal immigrants. I mean, we haven't had those for over 10 years, not since Operation Sovereign Borders was implemented. And so his track record is not good. And you mentioned him. Andrew Giles, he seems to be something of a a missing minister, I suppose, as of late. And now we've heard that emergency legislation was only developed after the release of these 150 or so detainees last year, despite meetings between Giles and officials. I think I might know the answer to this, Keith, but I'll let you go on it. Can we have any confidence at all in Andrew Giles?
Minister Giles, he's the Where's Wally of the federal parliament. I mean, the only difference is it's a red and white striped tie, and when you go look into the picture to try and find him, he's actually not in the picture. He can't be found. He's shown up this afternoon, in fact, in the last hour or so, to do a press conference. That's the first time he's been seen in public for literally days. And there are serious questions to answer here. Can you imagine, Daisy, if it was a coalition minister that was this incompetent? There would have been demands for their sacking weeks and weeks ago, and it would have been provided. Because on our side, we actually value competence and we expect our ministers to do the right thing and do their job. Minister Giles has been missing in action. And in fact, I've got a feeling he thought that the release of those detainees would be celebrated by the Australian people. And I think that's still his core belief.
Oh my goodness, that's an excellent point you raised, because as I mentioned, Labor's never been good on immigration. You know, they have what I think is a totally different mindset when it comes to borders. We saw that, remember that infamous clip of in 2015, Anthony Albanese saying that he wouldn't turn back boats. But by and large, the Australian electorate, unless you're in the Greens, of course, that's a whole other kettle of fish entirely. Generally speaking, most people in Australia have a mentality of strong borders. You know, we don't truck with what Europe does with people pouring over the border, or the US. We generally favour strong borders. Is this yet another example of how out of touch the Albanese government is with your average Australian?
Oh, the everyday Australian, Daisy, is a very fair individual. And they're happy to help people in their time of need, but they want to make sure that, you know, you go through the process, and they understand there's a process to go through if you want to come to this country. And in fact, many of them went through it. That's how they got there. They don't like the idea of people skipping the queue because they can afford it. They absolutely cannot stand the idea that these individuals may be a risk to Australia and Australia's national security. And they want to make sure that that process is absolutely adhered to make sure we don't have individuals that come here. And look at the examples. We've already seen what are, very clearly local terrorist attacks with knife attacks. Let's call them for what they are. In Australia in recent weeks, and I just find that appalling. It shouldn't happen here. We've got to make sure that that doesn't escalate and doesn't continue to occur. And one of the best ways to ensure that happens is we don't have these individuals here in the first place.
Good. I mean, to me, it's a very, very simple equation. You know, that's why we have strong borders. And as you mentioned, we are happy to help people in their time of need. That's why we do have a certain number of refugee places available every year, refugee visas. And our strong borders actually enable us to have more of those places to facilitate more people in need. So I think you raised some excellent points there about the Australian community. Now, Keith, stepping sideways, we are heading into budget season. The big event is coming up. Goodness giddy me. Can the taxpayers expect any kind of good news from Jim Chalmers? What if you had a crystal ball, what would you say this budget's going to be like?
Daisy, I'm actually terrified. I saw the reports. I am. I saw the reports in the media today. Jim Chalmers is claiming that Jimbonomics, he's going to go away from the orthodoxy. He's going to invent a new way that economics works. And apparently he's the only treasurer in the world who's smart enough to do this. But he's going to risk Australia's balance sheet and the prosperity of the Australian people to do it. And that really worries me. This idea that Jimbonomics will just fall out of the sky and there'll be some new concept about social welfare, and the budget's got to be about social outcomes, and it's not about numbers anymore. Well, budgets are about numbers. That's what's in there. So I am very concerned about the approach that Mr. Chalmers is taking and what it'll do to this country, because not everybody can be employed by the government.
No.
Right? The Made in America process, I know they call it Made in Australia, but currently it's Made in America. It's $1 billion for them so far. You can't have everyone employed by the taxpayer. It's completely unviable. I want every business to have an opportunity. I want them all to be profitable so they can employ Australian people and make this country successful. And yet we are going to see an interventionist budget next week, in my view. and I just don't think that's good for our country.
No, I mean, really, if you want an economy to flourish, the best thing that governments can do is leave it alone. Let the system, to a degree, of course, take care of itself. And look, you mentioned Jimbonomics. Just before we go, we know Jim Chalmers is an ideologue, isn't it? Remember the renowned 6,000-word essay he wrote a little bit of time ago, referring to stakeholder capitalism, which is some globalist thing from overseas that he's trying to import here. It's nonsense, yes. Tell us all why that's nonsense, Keith, before we go.
Well, as you said, the 6,000-word diatribe for Jimbonomics and his outline about how the budget, you've got to consider the social impact of everything. Well, what's the social impact of not being able to fund hospitals or to build roads or to pay for our defence force? If you don't make companies profitable, they can't employ anyone. It's really straightforward. And yet there seems to be this concept that the most important thing in the world is how good your social governance is, regardless of whether you can actually make a return or whether you can stay in the black or not. The fundamentals of economics don't change. And yet Jimbonomics, he must be the smartest man in the world, Daisy, because he's going to create something new and different that no one else can do, and it puts us all at risk.
It really does, and that Jimbonomics ideology really belongs one place, and that is in the undergraduate economics and arts departments of universities. It should stay there, and most certainly...
He's not even an undergraduate of economics.
No, exactly.
Political science, PhD in Paul Keating.
That is true. Actually, I was looking at that the other day. I was Googling Jim Chalmers for this segment, and I'm like, oh my God, he literally did his PhD in Paul Keating. I mean, that should certainly explains a lot about Jim Chalmers and his Jimbonomics. Keith Pitt, wonderful to have you on as always. You have a lovely evening, and we'll definitely talk to you again soon.
Great to be with you.